I'm Dr. Gribbins here again. So I'm going to finish up chordates today. So we talked about basal, or what we call primitive chordates last time, right? Which included things, or organisms, I should say, clades like urochordate, right? Cephalochordates. We also talked about cyclostomes, lampreys, and hagfish. And then we started talking about jawed fish, right? Which included chondrichthyes, actinopterygii, and then sarcopterygii. We're going to continue our discussion on the evolution of Sarcopterygii. We talked about two extant groups within the Sarcopterygians, right? The lungfish, Dipnoi, and then the coelacanths, right? Which we call Rhyptostidia. And there's a third group called tetrapods, or tetrapoda, which is a superclass. So that's where we're going to go today, talking about how tetrapods are actually nested within Sarcopterygian fish. So this is finishing up chapter 34, and tetrapods, or tetrapoda, means four-footed. So we're talking about four-footed or terrestrial organisms, right? So up here, this image here is of what we consider one of the more basal living tetrapods, which are salamanders, which are an amphibian. And this is a really old school, or an older group of salamander that we find in Mexico. What I like about it is it shows you the limbs and the toes, right? So particularly the limb becomes very, very derived in the distal, or the farthest portion of the limb from the trunk. And that is the wrist and the digits, the fingers, right? Which are going to support body weight. The other major adaptations happen in the girdles, right? The pelvic girdles in the hips and the pectoral girdles that become more robust and can help support body weight and attach those limbs to the backbone. So let's talk about tetrapods. So derived characters of tetrapods, they have very specific adaptations for obviously living on land, right? So their forelimbs and feet with digits are really important. So the fingers, right? Most living tetrapods have 4 to 5 fingers. Digit number was highly explored by evolution. There were anywhere from 4 to 12 digits in some of the fishes that we're going to talk about. But these limbs are weight-bearing limbs, and they're attached through very robust girdles, the pelvic and pectoral girdles. Matter of fact, the pelvic girdle, the hip bones, are large and fused directly to the backbone to support the body weight in the what we call the hind limbs. So there's also an absence of gills in these organisms for the most part, because we're breathing on land, and gills work very poorly on land. Now I will tell you, particularly in the amphibian group, there are several groups that have gills either in the larval stage, what we call the tadpole stage, or they retain gills as adults because they're completely aquatic. Two other major kind of adaptations of the tetrapods is the removal of the pectoral girdle from the head. In fish, the pectoral girdles that are going to support the pectoral fins are actually attached to the back of the skull, and that prevents them from moving independently, the shoulders, from the head. So one of the first developments within the tetrapods is the development of a neck, a few extra vertebrae, and the separation of the pectoral girdle from the head, so that now the head moves independent of the shoulders. Also, some bones are going to move from the skull and the gill arches to the back of the neck to support head weight. As you're going to see in some of these very early tetrapods, they have very elongated, very heavy skulls that are very crocodilian-like, and to hold them up against gravity is very difficult. So they developed a bone with some large muscles to help hold up the neck. One other feature we can throw onto here is the development of the tongue and what's called the hyoid bone. So I'll just throw those on the bottom of our list there. The tongue and the hyoid bone are also very, very important here. Most fish are going to suction feed. They're going to suck water in order to grab onto their prey. Obviously, suctioning air doesn't work as well because air is much lighter and less dense. And so the tongue was mobilized, and there are several muscles that control it. And now, in the early groups of tetrapods or amphibians, we can throw out the tongue. The tongue is sticky. We can grab onto prey and then bring that prey to the mouth. The hyoid bone, which is a couple gill arches that move and develop into a small bone right here in the neck actually support these muscles that actually move the tongue around to either manipulate food or actually throw it out of the body to capture food. And so the tongue and hyoid become very important in these early groups of tetrapods also. So over here we have one of my favorite tree frogs, a red-eyed tree frog here, that is common in Central and South America. So let's talk about kind of some of the transition that happened between the fishes and the intermediates in order for them to move on to land, right? And you can spend a ton of time. There are huge textbooks on this, and it's based off of a lot of the transitional fossils that we have. And so I'm going to introduce you to some of those transitional fossils. This is a really cool rendition of the shallow, what we would call fresh or brackish water environments that was around about 375 million years ago, where our first tetrapods actually started evolving from fish. As I mentioned earlier, tetrapods like us inherited several features from fish that allow us to be good tetrapods, right? Or efficient tetrapods. One of them is an endoskeleton, right? A bony, ossified endoskeleton. Limbs, movable limbs from the sarcopterygians that are fleshy and have muscle in them to support body weight. And also our lungs, right? Which were air bladders for neutral buoyancy that were attached to the digestive tract. And so we inherit those properties from, or those features, those characteristics from fish. And really the evolution of and basically diversification of the limbs in particular occurred not to move on to land at first, but to become very, very efficient fish in a very shallow, crowded environment like you see here. And so they can hunt fish better, they can move around trunks and weeds and shallow water and debris better, and actually be better predators, maybe keystone or apex predators, in these shallow water environments. Now at the same time, about 375 million years ago, there were a lot of animal groups in the insecta that were actually evolving and diversifying, that were actually completely terrestrial already. And they were moving around the terrestrial environment. And as these fish, these what we're going to call labyrinthodonts and stegocephalians, as they evolved to become better and better predators of fish, they could actually start exploiting the terrestrial environment a little bit by using what I like to call the water terrestrial environment boundary, right? The water's edge on land. And these insects had to land and drink water. So you can imagine if a fish could capture those insects, not necessarily spend its entire time outside in the terrestrial environment, but spent most of his time in the aquatic environment and took advantage of capturing prey by ambush that were coming to drink. And that becomes readily apparent in the development of the skull. Once you start looking at the skull of these stegocephalians, it becomes very elongated, crocodilian-like, and the eyes move from lateral positions to the top of the head, which suggests that they could stick their head just out of the water and move to some drinking insects and maybe ambush them. Right? Leave the water to capture them and pull them into the water like crocodilians do. And you can imagine if you're a fish in an environment where there's a lot of competition for food, if you can take advantage of a food source outside of the water, then the characteristics that are going to allow you to be adaptive that way are going to be passed on very quickly because you're going to survive to reproductive age, right, through natural selection. So that's how these tetrapod forms evolved, and we'll start to show you some of the intermediate fish that we have nice skeletons for that we think are transitional fossils. And so here are some of these transitional fossils, starting from more basal or older to more recent transitional fossils. And so the top ones here, Pandrichthyes, this is obviously a fish, right? You look at it, it's very fish-like. It has the dorsal fins, it has pelvic, anal, and pelvic fins. It has pectoral, pelvic, and anal fins. It has a caudal fin. So it spent all of its time in the water. And through the evolution of this group of fish, as you move further along through the evolution, this fish becomes more derived. Its actual limbs become more fleshy and more mobile, which allows them to move through this crowded environment much more efficiently. So the limbs actually continue to evolve to allow these fish to be very good aquatic predators. But as you start moving through their evolution, notice their skull starts to flatten and the eyes are starting to move from here up, as you can see, and they become very dorsal, or on top of the head. And it allows them, as you can see here, this guy sitting in the water, to kind of put its head above water to maybe hunt some of these insects. You can also see the limbs become much more tetrapod-like. Notice there are no fingers here. There's still a web edge over the top of the bones here, whereas you move into acanthostega and ichthyostega, they actually start developing digits, or what we like to call fingers and toes, right? Which maybe help them support body weight. They can actually leave the water for short periods of time and maybe come back into the water as they hunt. And then you have these two nice transitional fossils, Pteropres and Diactides, which are basically very tetrapod-like. Diactides was definitely thought to be completely terrestrial, or a tetrapod. It's almost lizard and amphibian-like as far as its morphine. And if you compare that to a living salamander, so here's a living salamander from today. This is an image I took a couple years ago. This is a smallmouth salamander you can find here in Indiana. This guy, which is, about anywhere from 3 to 4 inches long, is much smaller than these big guys, which are several feet long, right? But they are very salamander-like, and salamanders still retain a lot of these, what we call basal or ancestral features of these transitional fish. So here's kind of a phylogenetic tree that shows the tetrapods in comparison to fish. So notice, tetrapods are considered sister to lungfish, right? So lungfish have a lot of characteristics, particularly the lungs, and some of the DNA studies that have recently been done suggest that they are closely related to our extant tetrapods, which include amphibians and what we're going to call amniota, or the amniotes. You can see in between those we have all of these intermediates. And these intermediates are those fish that I've been mentioning or talking about here over the last several minutes. And I called those guys, remember, labyrinthodonts or stegocephalians, right? So the names, these two names, labyrinthodont refers to the deep grooves that are found in the teeth of these transitional fish. All of them have the similar teeth. They also have, obviously, these limbs that are fleshy limbs that start off as fins and then transition into actual limbs that may be able to support body weight. And stegocephaline, stego means head of foot, which simply means feet that are close to the head that can support body weight. And that's where those two names come from. And you notice here that you start off very fish-like with Pandrictes, and as you move down to Acanthostega and Telopteron here, we have organisms that start to look very, very amphibian-like, right? Very, very salamander-like, as you'll see. So these transitions obviously allow organisms, these vertebrates, to be better predators of the terrestrial or water boundary. And you can imagine if once they made that move onto land and then they were taking advantage of food sources that no other vertebrates at that time were taking advantage of, and then you can diversify into the groups to fill niches in the terrestrial environment. So the modern or the living groups of tetrapods include what is a group called Lys amphibian, or modern amphibians, and then amniotes. And that's kind of where we're going to go next, talking about our living groups. All right, so we talked about tetrapod characteristics, those including weight-bearing limbs with digits, right? 5 typically, and wrists, bones that can support body weight. Girdles, right, a pectoral and pelvic girdle that are fused to the vertebrae, at least the pelvic girdles fused to the vertebrae, to allow for body weight support. The separation of the head via the neck so that the shoulders and head are separated from one another now. The development of bones that are going to be in the ear for hearing, right? So the ear develops so that these animals can hear, because the lateral line system doesn't work as well. And then also the development of some bones that are going to move from the gill arches into the ears. We're going to call those ossicles. I'll show you some images of that as we move into and start talking about some of these tetrapod groups. All of these characteristics that we've been talking about along the way are characteristics that allow these animals to take advantage of the terrestrial environment. So classically, there are four main classes in the super class that we call tetrapoda. When I learned them, they were the amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. This taxonomic scheme is no longer accepted because birds are now considered reptiles, and you can't talk about one or the other without excluding some of the species that are found in each of these groups, or what we would call a paraphyletic grouping, right? And so now birds are reptiles, or considered reptiles. And so we're actually going to take birds, we're going to merge them into reptiles, and then split the reptilia, or reptiles, up into two major classes. So I'll show you that taxonomic scheme. All right, so the new phylogeny, which taxonomy tries to go along with, includes these two groups. So we still have amphibia and we still have mammalia, the amphibians and the mammals, but now we've merged the birds into what we're calling the reptiles, and the reptiles are now broken up into the Lepidosauria, which includes the Tuatara, the lizards and snakes, and then Archelosauria, which includes turtles, crocodilians, and birds. And you'll soon know when I show you another phylogeny that most of the dinosaurs are also in this group we call Archelosauria. So archosaurs are a group of dinosaurs that Jurassic Park made famous. The velociraptors, T-Rex all belong in that group. And birds are direct descendants, are nested directly within that group. Crocodilians are going to be sister to the dinosaurs, which includes the birds. And then turtles are sister to the archosaurs. So if you read any herpetology text, any text that specifically are going to focus on reptiles, it's been from the 1990s to the early 2000s, turtles were very controversial as far as where they fit phylogenetically. The most recent DNA data suggests that they are actually very closely related to the archosaurs. Turtles traditionally are put up here. They're going to be more of a basal group, and now they're considered more of a derived group that has reversed in evolution as far as skull type, and obviously the shell, which is a very specific structure that's found in no other vertebrate, makes it very, very hard to taxonomically place them somewhere. All right, so let's talk about these groups. We're going to start up here with the amphibians, work through the reptiles, and then do mammals last. All right, so here's our true classification. This is the classification we're going to use based on the newest science, and these are the ones that are typically accepted. So we're going to walk through amphibians, mammals, lepidosaurs, and archelosaurs. Got a couple images down here. Here's me holding a crocodilian that I captured in Costa Rica. Here's a picture I took of a snapping turtle, right, which was included in Archelosauria. And we got a nice hummingbird here from Costa Rica that I took a couple years ago. All three of these belong in the Archelosauria, this newest taxon. All right, so let's start with the amphibians. So within amphibia, within class amphibia, there are going to be these orders, three orders. And they are called the caecilians, the salamanders, and the frogs and toads. And I'll give you some nice taxonomic names for those. So let's look at these amphibians. So superclass tetrapoda, class amphibia, includes frogs, salamanders, and newts. And also includes a group you've probably never heard of, which are called caecilians. And so amphibios means two-lived, and they have two different lives. One being they live partly in water in one part of their life cycle, and partly on land in the other part of their life cycle. So here you got a nice picture of a southern leopard frog that I took from southern Indiana, and here's a tadpole, right? So there's a tadpole stage and then a terrestrial adult stage, right? If you look at the fossil record, these guys, the modern amphibians, arose about roughly around 370 million years ago. So what are some characteristics of this group? So here's some images of these organisms. So We have, frogs up here. We got a frog here calling. We got a couple pictures of frogs calling here to actually attract mates. And we got some pictures of some of the salamanders down here. So most of the groups of amphibians need to find either a moist habitat or actually find water in order to breathe. They typically are going to lay their eggs in the terrestrial environment, and those eggs lack a shell or any protective covering around them. So they have to be laid in water so that they don't desiccate or become dehydrated. So all these guys, as you can see up here in this first image with our frogs, work their way back, work their way back to water, right, in order to reproduce. And then the female will dump her eggs, and these are all eggs around masses of eggs around these two frogs. And the male will sit on the female in a backwards position, grabbing onto her hips. That process is called amplexus, is the name given to that. And amplexus is when the male grabs onto the female, positions himself so that he can dump sperm on top of the eggs as the female releases them. Most amphibians have what's called complete metamorphosis, where the larva is completely aquatic and looks really different from the adults, as I'll show you some pictures of some tadpoles. All amphibians have a 3-chambered heart, which is different than the fishes, right? Fishes have 2-chambered hearts. Remember, fish have an atrium and a ventricle. Amphibians and the lungfish, and I don't think I mentioned that in the last lecture, but lungfish also have 3-chambered hearts. So amphibians and lungfish, they still have 1 ventricle, but now they have 2 atria. So that extra atrium is added to attach the lungs to circulation. So that happened in the fish, right? To attach, you have gills and lungs, so you have to attach both. So the lungs are attached to circulation via that extra atrium. And that 3-chambered heart continues into the evolution and development of amphibians, which have 2 atria and 1 ventricle. Amphibians are very environmentally sensitive, and the reason for that is because their skin is very thin because they breathe through it. And because of that, they can take up toxins, or are very sensitive to drying out, or very sensitive to changes in the environment. And so they could be species that we utilize to understand whether our environment's healthy or not, depending on their numbers and their diversity. As I mentioned, all are dependent on water for reproduction, and most of them are oviparous, which means most amphibians are going to lay their eggs into the environment. There are some that retain their eggs, and believe it or not, there's one species of salamander that's viviparous, like we are, but 99.9% of amphibians lay eggs in water. They have external fertilization. The male dumps his sperm on those eggs, and all amphibians have a cloaca. Well, a cloaca, the literal translation of cloaca is sewer. So the digestive tract, the urinary tract, and the reproductive tracts all dump into that common chamber before it is evacuated to the exterior, and that's what cloaca means. The cloaca can be also found in reptiles, in birds, and even a few mammals. So they don't have separate openings for each of those. They all dump into that common chamber. And as I mentioned, all amphibians have cutaneous respiration. So here are a couple images. You have a couple frogs here, both of which are calling. These are males that actually have a vocal sac that they blow up, and then they empty it, and it vibrates and it produces sound. I'll show you a video of that later. And then we have some salamanders here that many people haven't seen before because they don't go out and lift up rocks or logs in the forest. But salamanders are very common here in Indiana. We have several. We have over a dozen species of salamanders here in Indiana. We got lots of frogs also. So a couple images here for adaptations to land, which we've kind of already talked about, right? So these are, again, some of the characteristics that I've mentioned over and over again that have to do with amphibians. So here is over here our 3-chambered heart. So we have 2 atria and 1 ventricle, and this third chamber, the second atrium, attaches the lungs to circulation. And so you can see here's where the heart is placed, and we have these large lungs, and that third chamber allows us to attach or connect the lungs to circulation so we can pick up oxygen from the air that we breathe. One other neat thing about amphibians is they send a blood vessel from pulmonary circulation from the lungs to the skin to actually gather oxygen from the skin. And interestingly, frogs can actually control how much blood enters the lungs versus the skin. So when a frog's sitting, for example, on the edge of a pond and is breathing, it will be sending all of its blood to the lungs, right? And if you go to catch it and it jumps in the water, it can then sit underwater and watch you until you leave, and you can sit there for 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes, and the frog will stay submerged. And the reason it can do that is because it'll take all of the blood that was going to the lungs and now send it to the skin, and then use the skin so that it can extract oxygen from the water. It's a fantastic adaptation that allows for escapage of predation, allows them to stay underwater for long periods of time, also allows them to hibernate underwater. A lot of the aquatic frogs hibernate underwater also. So lungs, you need more blood. You need a three-chambered heart to connect the lungs to circulation. We have increased senses of hearing and vision. The eyes are really large in our modern amphibians. They also have very sensitive eyes. They can see really well in the dark. And they hear well. And so the development of the ear, as I mentioned, with a membrane called the tympanic membrane, okay? Or what's called the tympanum, or what we call the external eardrum. We call that the eardrum. And then we have some ossicles, which are small bones that are attached to the eardrum, so that when sound comes in and hits the eardrum's going to vibrate, and then these ossicles move really quickly in response to that because of their very efficient joints, and that amplifies the sound to specialized organs within the inner ear that then can transmit that information of sound to the brain. And so, as I mentioned, I think earlier, the lateral line system doesn't work very well, right? In the terrestrial environment, so the development of ears allows us to pick up sound in the air. They have very sturdy limbs, efficient digits, right, and wrists that can support body weight, and also very sturdy. We could even put here, right, next to the limbs, we could put pelvic and pectoral girdles, right? So we can put pelvic and pectoral girdles. So not only the limbs, but the girdles that attach those limbs to the spinal cord and to the trunk. Another feature here is that most fish are going to excrete ammonia over their gills. Ammonia is the waste product of the breakdown of proteins within the body, which all vertebrates do. Fish just release the ammonia through their gills because they live in water. It takes a whole bunch of water to basically remove the ammonia, if you will, from the body. And when you live in water, that's not a big deal, right? But when you move on to the terrestrial environment, now we need to conserve water, so ammonia is not really the way that we want to transport our waste products from protein breakdown, and so we convert that ammonia to urea. Urea is much safer to carry through the body, and urea also, you can see I'm circling urea here, is also more water, it's going to be easier to remove from the body by using less water. Reproduction. Okay, so reproduction, as I've already mentioned, in amphibians, fertilization is external. They have to go back to water in most cases in order to reproduce. And the reason for that, there's no amnion, there's no extra embryonic membranes around the egg to protect it from water loss. Many attract their mates either through sound or chemicals. So the chemicals here are called pheromones, is the name given to them. So pheromones are the chemicals that are released from, for example, salamanders to attract mates, whereas frogs, they use the vocal sac on the bottom of the neck that they can blow up, and then they can basically empty as quickly as possible, which produces vibration. And we have a video of that I'll show you. Here's amplexus. I caught this image here in Costa Rica. It's a very nice image of a male and female red-eyed tree frog, and you can see they're basically on a leaf above water, and this is the egg sac that the female is laying on the surface of this egg, and the male is coating it with sperm as the eggs leave the female cloaca. And this is amplexus. This is called amplexus here, as we mentioned earlier. So frogs have complete metamorphosis, which simply means that they have a larval stage. This larval stage is completely different than the adult terrestrial stage. What's really interesting about frogs is the larva feeds in the aquatic environment, which simply means that it doesn't eat the same food sources or on the same trophic level as the adults. Therefore, the adults and larvae never compete, and that's why frogs are so successful, because the larva grows and eats algae or detritus or dead materials within the aquatic environment. The adults live in the terrestrial environment and eat insects. They're insectivores, they're carnivores. And so because they don't share the same trophic level that they feed on, the tadpoles and adults never compete. So that makes it very successful to raise your tadpoles in an environment that's different than the adults, that produces great success in the larva making it through metamorphosis to the adult stage. Okay, so let's go through the three orders of amphibians. So the first one is called Gymnophonia, and it includes the caecilians and the apodans. I love the term apodan, which means footless. A means without, poda means feet. So these are very worm-like amphibians. They look much like a big earthworm. Some of them can be really brightly colored. And they do have scales, which is very odd, right? As you can see here, calcified scales, which is very odd for amphibians. Most amphibians have no scales in their skin. They have glandular toxic secreting skin, which is common across all amphibians. And they're commonly found underground, and that's called fossorial, is the term given to that. Fossorial. So we know least about this group because they live underground almost their entire life. The only time we ever come in contact with them is if they get washed out of their burrows or flooded out of their burrows, or we dig them up on accident. And most of them, or all of them, are found in the southern hemisphere. So there are none of them, for example, in the United States. They're all down in Central and South America. They have eyes, but they're covered over with skin, so they can detect light, but they can't see. So they're a very interesting group. Some of them lay eggs and then protect the eggs. There is actually a completely aquatic species that was just recently discovered. The ones that are very brightly colored have very toxic secretions. Some that can even kill humans if they're ingested, these poisons. So that is the group we call caecilians. The second group is a group everybody, I assume, is familiar with, and is the most successful group of amphibian, which are called the frogs. So this order is called Anura. All right, again, a great name because Anura means tailless. So as adults, they lack tails. All frogs lack tails except for one species, which actually has a tail. But all the rest of frogs lack tails. So they have stout bodies, elongated back limbs, and can jump incredibly far away from a resting sitting position. Again, glandular skin that secretes mucus or toxins that are either taste really bad or burn the eyes, or can be, in some cases, again, very, very toxic and even kill humans if it's ingested. Most of them, the adults, are carnivorous, which means they eat insects. Mostly they're insectivores as adults. And the tadpoles are omnivores. They eat either dead matter, other organisms, or algae. And a lot of these guys, a lot of the frogs are keystone groups or keystone species within their niches that they occupy. They're either very important as a food source, particularly the tadpoles, or are apex predators in many cases in some of their niches that they live in. So you got several species of frogs up here. This one, one of my favorite frogs here in the middle, where you can see my pointer, is called the glass frog, and you can see the heart through their skin. So they have very transparent, very thin skin, and that's why they're called glass frogs. You can actually see the reproductive organs and most of the organs of the body on the ventral or belly surface. All frogs call, or for the most part, to attract mates. And the males call, the females are attracted to the call, and then they can meet at a water source and lay the eggs externally. They're all oviparous. They lay their eggs, and then the males fertilize them. Almost all frogs hunt with their tongue. As you can see here, this bottom picture here on the right is a mantella that is throwing its tongue out to catch a fruit fly. So they use that tongue, remember the development of the tongue, to capture prey. So as I mentioned, males call for females. All right, the salamanders are in the order Chordata. And Chordata means tailed one. That's where the term comes from. And so they have very long tails, or tails. As you can see, here's a nice spring salamander that has a long tail. Here's a newt down here that has a tail, all right? Couple of other salamanders here. There are a group called giant salamanders, which have the largest amphibians in the world. So this here is a Chinese giant salamander, the one here in the middle, and it can get upwards of about almost 6 feet in length. Live in deep lakes in Japan and China. So again, adults and larvae both have tails. The larvae of salamanders look like miniature adults with gills. Some salamanders retain those gills as adults and live in water permanently. The largest salamanders are completely aquatic. Some can regenerate limbs or even the tail when they lose them. And their skin, again, can be very toxic, as you can see with the bright warning colors, right? The oranges and the yellows and the bright blues on frogs and salamanders tell predators that they taste bad or are very poisonous or very toxic. Probably the most interesting thing about Chordata is they kind of have an intermediate reproductive kind of technique. They actually, the males, will produce sperm in a little package called a spermatophore, and then they will drop that, and the female picks it up with her cloaca, and fertilization is internal, and then she either lays eggs in the water or under a log, for example. And so this packaging of sperm here, called a spermatophore, is unique to the salamander group. This is a picture here on the second picture here on the bottom right, which is a spermatophore, and it looks like a mushroom. What's interesting is each salamander species has a spermatophore that's kind of unique to that species, so it's almost like a fingerprint. Salamander biologists can actually go into a pond and look at the spermatophores under a microscope and know which salamanders are actually in the pond. Pretty neat, right? And so you can see it looks like a mushroom because the base keeps the sperm, you can see the fuzziness, these are the sperm heads sticking out, off the substrate, because sperm is very fragile and keep it off the substrate. And it's kind of rounded at the top to make it easy for the female to pick up. Salamanders have very complicated pre-reproductive rituals where the male dances at a lot of times or strokes the female to see if the female is interested, and if she is, he'll drop a spermatophore and the female will pick it up. So those are your salamanders. So those are your three groups: the caecilians, the salamanders, and the frogs. And I thought I'd throw up here a complete kind of life cycle of dart frogs. I breed dart frogs, and I have right now actually about 30 tadpoles and some brand new froglets. And this is a picture series I took a few years ago of that process from egg. This is the fertilized egg, all the way up through these first two slides, or I should say these first three pictures past the egg are organogenesis, with the development of the organs. So the first thing that develops here on the top of the egg is the central nervous system, the brain on top, the spinal cord along the length of the egg. Then you start to get the development of the gills and the eyes, the nostrils, and then the rest of the organs. And you can see here as you move through, the yolk disappears as the embryo uses it up to develop all the organs and organ structures. You can see the nice set of gills coming off of the tadpole in the egg. Eventually what happens with dart frogs is that their eggs are laid either in really shallow water or within bromeliads, plants that have water sitting in them. And that water's really hot, really warm in the tropics where these frogs are from, and so there's very little oxygen in the water. So the gills are pretty useless except for development. So they drop the gills, and that's when you know they're ready to hatch, and they hatch gill-less, and then they come up and gulp air into their developing lungs, and that's how they get air. And then they grow to a certain size and start developing color, get their hind limbs, their forelimbs, and then they reabsorb their tail, and then you get little froglets here. Dart frogs often have complicated parental care. So here's a male dart frog carrying around its tadpoles from bromeliad to bromeliad. And you remember how sharks practice oophagy, the feeding of eggs to the young? So do dart frogs. A lot of dart frogs also practice that oophagy characteristic where the female will come and release fertilized eggs, will release unfertilized eggs into the water source that the tadpoles are in to feed them, which is kind of neat. So they practice oophagy too, which is an example of convergent evolution there, right? So this particular frog is called Dendrobates tinctorius, which is the dying frog, like somebody dumped a bunch of colors or dye on its back.